So Peter came to Antioch as a Jew, and he was participating in the love feast. He was sitting there. He was eating the food just like everybody else. Now that was highly unusual for a Jew. A strict Jew would not eat a meal with a Gentile. A strict Jew would not even do business with a Gentile. A strict Jew would not go on a trip, receive hospitality, or give hospitality to a Gentile. There was such a racial barrier there, discrepancy, division. Would have nothing to do. So Peter, though, he learned his lesson, seemingly. In Acts chapter 10, he had an invitation to go to a Gentile's house, and he said, no way, I'm not going to that guy's house. I'm a good Jew. But God showed him in a vision that all things are clean. Take and eat. Unclean animal. Peter said, never. I've never eaten anything unclean. But God said, whatever I tell you to do, you do it. It's clean. So seemingly Peter had learned his lesson. So when he comes to Antioch, he's eating with the Gentiles. He's having fellowship with Gentile believers. And then a group from Jerusalem comes. Paul says they were from James. Not specifically, James didn't send them, but James was one of the pillars there in Jerusalem. And so they were the Judaizers who tormented Paul everywhere he went. So here's Peter eating and fellowshipping with these Gentiles. And then this group of Jews come in. Fearing what they thought of him, he withdrew from the Gentiles. He stopped participating in the love feast with the Gentiles. And what did he communicate when he did that? That I am better than you. There's a division here. Sure, you say you're in Christ, I say I'm in Christ, but there's still a difference there. And that just irked the Apostle Paul. He confronted him. He called him out on it. He said, you are wrong. We looked at this more in detail last week, but Paul confronts him face to face. You are wrong. You're acting in fear. You're afraid of what these folks think of you. You're afraid of being thought less of. You're afraid of losing your influence. So Peter acted in fear. Secondly, he acted with pride. He acted with pride. It was his pride that made him concerned about what they thought of him in the first place, didn't it? Isn't it what motivates most of us? Our pride. We're more concerned about what other people think of us. Think with me just a minute. How many times has your pride or my pride caused a conflict with other people? Boy, it's usually the source of conflict, isn't it? I want to do things my way. Well, there's a fine line between pride and selfishness, isn't it? In our marriage relationship, I've always heard selfishness will get you in trouble and pride will keep you there. Selfishness will get you in trouble and pride will keep you there. I'm not going to go apologize. I'm not going to make things right. But Peter was acting in pride because he was more concerned about what these Jews thought of him. He was more concerned with his reputation. Peter's problem was he was too full of Peter. I've told you many times, my biggest problem is my wife's first husband. And for the uninformed, that's me. Too full of myself. We're too full of our own desires, too full of wanting to have our way, and our pride creates conflict. Can you think of situations where pride has kept you at odds with someone? Peter was acting in fear because he was more concerned about Peter than he was the truth. He acted thirdly in hypocrisy. Verse 13. The rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. This is before Barnabas and Paul parted ways, so Barnabas was at this time was Paul's right-hand man, and Barnabas, being a Jew, he saw what Peter did, and he said, well, if Peter's going to do that, I'm going to do that as well. Have you ever noticed how a negative, critical spirit impacts other people? That's why the writer of Hebrews says, see to it that no root of bitterness springs up in you, and that by it, that root of bitterness, many be defiled. It only takes one negative word. It only takes one wrong action to impact the lives of other people. And that's what Barnabas did. He was following Peter's lead out of respect, or maybe he too, obviously out of fear and pride. But Paul said that Peter was acting in hypocrisy. See, Peter knew better. Peter knew the truth of the gospel. God had already given him a personal revelation. But again, conflict with other people many times occurs when we lose our integrity. When we lose our integrity. It may be a lie, it may be a shady deal, but when we begin to compromise our integrity, we can cause pain in the lives of other people. See, integrity is this. It's being the same person on the outside that you are on the inside. Hypocrisy is this, trying to pretend to be something that you're not. And when we lose our integrity, when we try to pretend to be something we're not, we're going to cause problems because we're not genuine. We're wishy-washy. People can't trust us. People don't know what to depend on when we're acting in hypocrisy. So think with me for just a minute about this confrontation. Here's the Apostle Paul. What do we know about Paul? Well, we know he had some kind of thorn in the flesh. He was not a physical specimen. You know, the church at Corinth said, you're mighty in words, but when you get here, well, you're nothing to look at. Some people have said he's just kind of a small man, probably weak eyes, very frail in health. And when Peter comes to town, what do you think about with Peter? I think of something like Rolando McClain or somebody, some big football player, you know, Dick Butkus. Peter, fisherman. And here comes a little Paul withstanding him face to face. Peter, you were afraid. You were acting in pride. You're being a hypocrite. Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is when we are pretending to be something we're not. Have you ever expected things, unrealistic expectations from other people? You're expecting them to live in a way that you're not even living yourself. How many times a conflict caused in the home in a marriage when the husband has unreal expectations? He's expecting things from his wife when the wife is expecting certain things from her husband, and she's not even living up to those expectations. That's exactly what Paul is talking about here. Hypocrisy is a source of conflict. Our demand that others try to meet our unreal expectations, to live a level, to give when we're not willing to give. That's hypocrisy. That's hypocrisy. To forgive, please forgive me, when we're not willing to forgive. That's hypocrisy. When we're expecting things from other people that we're not willing to do ourselves, that is hypocrisy. And that creates conflict. Well, what's the solution to conflict? Quickly. There's a time to confront. But when Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Again, I'm just trying to get a mental picture of that. The Apostle Paul and Peter. Boy, what a confrontation. What a confrontation. I bet that Paul was on him, I mean, in a spirit of love, but he was not afraid to confront. Not only because of Peter's stature, but Peter's position. He was a pillar in the church. But there is a time to confront. Now here's a couple things I want you to listen very carefully. Paul went to Peter face to face. He didn't go behind his back. This is, I think, in my opinion, one of the greatest problems in the church. Is that instead of going to the person that we have a problem with, we go to someone else. We go behind their back. What do we call it whenever we do something God tells us not to do? Sin. That's right. Sin. I think one of the greatest sins in the church, instead of going to the person face to face, we go behind their back. There's a time to confront. Paul went to Peter. He didn't go to anyone else. He went to Peter face to face, man to man. Paul felt that this was an issue that needed to be dealt with. There is a time to confront. He couldn't let this slide. Don Shula, I read a quote whenever he was coaching the Miami Dolphins. He had made a statement. He said that we never let a mistake go unchallenged. Uncorrected mistakes multiply. A reporter asked him, isn't it okay just to overlook one small flaw every now and then? He said, there are no small flaws. There are no small flaws. You know, are we to be people gracious? Yes, we're to be gracious. We're to be kind. We're to be forgiving. But when there is a potential for conflict, we need to take the Barney Fife approach. What is it? Nip it, nip it, nip it. There's a time to confront. And it is the sooner the better. If we let these things set, as my granny says, they're going to fester. They're going to fester. And they will multiply, as Don Shula says. Many people, I think most people, don't like confrontation. But whether it's in our marriage or with our children, in our business, in our church, with our neighbors, if there's a potential disagreement, we need to go face to face. There's a time to confront. Secondly, we must confront in love. Your attitude is everything. Our attitude is everything. You can do the right thing the wrong way and you're wrong. Let me say that again. You can do the right thing, which would be to confront, but you do it with the wrong attitude and you're wrong. It's all about our attitude. We must have an attitude of love. Paul's motivation was a love for God, the love for God's people, the love for truth, and even a love for Peter. Because Peter stood condemned, Paul said. Peter stood condemned. Paul loved him enough to confront him in his sin. We must confront in love. We must confront with truth. Truth. Paul reminded Peter, verses 15 and 16, that no one is justified by the works of the law. Paul said to Peter, what you're doing is wrong. As Paul understood Peter's actions, he confronted him in truth. Now let me just say this, before you and I confront, make sure we got the truth. Make sure we've got the truth. I think of the older brother in the story of the prodigal who came back, and he was so upset with his younger brother because he thought the younger brother was just going to come waltzing back into the house, be restored as a son, have everything as if nothing had ever happened. But that wasn't the truth. The older brother thought that the younger son had come back to be a son, when in reality the younger son had come back to be a what? A servant, a slave. He said, how many of my father's servants eat better than I eat, after he'd been in that pig pen for a while?